Thank you, Edezio. We'll be hearing now Iona Datta, which is a senior lecturer in citizenship and belonging in the University of Leeds, UK. Her research and writing focuses broadly on the gendered processes of citizenship and belonging and the politics of urbanization across the global north and south. Iona is going to speak about the elusive struggle for the legal city, squatters, tenure, and the myth of resettlement in Delhi slum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mona and the organizers, for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be here. I'll try and do justice to a big project in 20 minutes. So I'm going to draw upon a very specific aspect of a project which I completed some time back in a book. But what I'm going to talk about today is about the myth of resettlement. And I'm really pleased that Nick Blomley touched upon the narratives and storytelling around planning. And certainly the myth of resettlement is about storytelling. And it's about telling a story which valorises resettlement as a form of power, as the right to property becoming a route to transformation for squatters. So in presenting this, I want to start with three key ideas that I want to talk about today, given the time. One is, as I said, the issue of property rights becoming valorized, particularly in the Indian planning system, but also as a story that is being told by NGOs, by social activists, that squatters are interested in moving from their slums if they are provided resettlement. So resettlement becomes a mobilizing force in arguing for rights to the city. So in that, there is the storytelling around resettlement, which tries to make it appear that resettlement equals to private property. And I want to investigate that a little bit. Then the other issue around that is the issue of what resettlement does to the people who are waiting for it. So my work has been in a slum in Delhi, which was particularly at this cusp of moving from an eviction to a resettlement. And they weren't really sure of whether they're going to be resettled, how many, where, when. So all those issues created a fear of uncertainty for them. So what happens at that moment when squatters are waiting for resettlement and they don't really know what's going to happen to them? And then the third question at the end of it is a bigger question, and it's a question of, I think that is happening more and more in India, but also I think in other parts of the world, around slums and participatory planning and participatory governance processes. And what many political theorists and scholars have talked about as the problem of post-political governance, where politics and political are being fused together. And you see this in a number of slum resettlement schemes, such as the very highly publicized Dharavi scheme, where there was a participatory process, and it's still in the process of removing slum dwellers from the slum to resettlement high-rise housing next to it. This is in Mumbai I'm talking about, for those of you who are not familiar with Dharavi. So these are the three things I think important to consider. I can't go into them in great detail, but this is certainly the way I'm thinking about the myth of resettlement. But first, I think it's important to see, where does this myth originate from? Where is the origin of this myth of resettlement? Anesha Gertner, who's written about Delhi slums as well, talks about this as a wide range of popular stories around successful slum relocation programs in the 1970s and 80s, when land and resources were more widely available. And these, he suggests, mythologize resettlement plots as equal in standing to private plots. Furthermore, the DDA and municipal corporation run slum surveys prior to removing a slum to establish resettlement eligibility, which, in addition to enumerating and registering slum households, construct a compelling image of resettlement colonies as fully serviced, permanent, and integrated residential spaces, something akin to a private plot. And this is the issue here, that we need to investigate that. But also, I think what is quite interesting is that this is the story that is not just told by people who are working with slum dwellers, but this is the story, as you'll see in this presentation, is being told by the slum dwellers themselves. And that is where I think we need to understand what's going on. A lot of studies have been done of resettlement schemes, and the most recent ones being done by Kalyani Menonsen and Gautam Bhan talk about resettlement as a hoax. because most of these resettlement colonies were built without any basic services. So what they conclude is that legalization through resettlement is a myth, since it has pushed those in legal settlements into illegality in order to meet their basic needs. So just to elaborate on that, I want to go quickly on this first part. So this is the resettlement in the 1970s and 1980s. This is a plan of Delhi, and the big bubbles you see are the number of people resettled. And mostly in the 70s and 80s, resettlement happened, of course, on the peripheries, and it's still happening now. But what has happened now is that these peripheral areas in the 70s and 80s have become part of the city center. And the slum that I was studying was at the south, in South Delhi, and now it's cheek and jowl with very well-known middle-class colonies. Now, I can't go into the politics of that. There was a huge politics of the Indian emergency in the late 1970s, which resulted in the city beautification and the movement of slums. But what was interesting is the story that was told at that time is that these were private plots, these were freehold plots, and they were usually about 80 square meters. And so the history and legacy of that is that even now, it's perceived that resettlement will be that kind of private rectangular plots on pieces of land which are big enough to have incremental housing in them. And certainly squatters, when they think about resettlement, this is the image that comes to their mind. More recently, since 2000, we've seen a huge violence of law or an urban development that has been spatializing the squatters and the squatter resettlement colonies even further outside Delhi. And the red dots, or the red squares, as you can see, are the ones which are the new resettlement colonies. And the purple circles are from where they have been removed. But these are very different. These are different because the provisions for resettlement are not the same as they were in the 1970s and 80s. And the rights to resettlement and the rights to freehold property for the squatters have actually reduced. So how have they reduced? And this is sort of summing up what I showed in the last two maps. So the provisions for resettlement in the 60s usually was an 80 square meter freehold resettlement plot. And the squatters were able to build over time, and they were able to build their houses. As the family expanded, they would add another floor above it. In the 1970s, also, the resettlement was in situ, so the slums themselves were upgraded, they were reorganized, they were given water services, infrastructure, and so on. But the plot sizes reduced. They reduced to 40 square meters. In 1982, they began to, again, reduce the plot sizes further to 25 square meters. It was still freehold. But from 2000, we see the enactment of a very punitive law. There was a very important legal judicial ruling passed, which essentially named slums as illegal citizens, as pickpockets of public land. So from the 2000s, when resettlement was carried on, and this is the last slide you saw with the red dots. So all these places, Narela, Putkalan, Rohini, Bhakarwal, all these places where the slum dwellers were moved to in the resettlement colonies were not freehold properties. These were licensed properties, licensed for 10 years, and they were given the license of inhabitation. And more interestingly, they were based upon how long the squatters have been in the city, and that was based on proving how long through different gray documents. So 18 square meter plots, if they were settled, if they could prove that they were settled before 31st of January 1990, and 12.5 square meter plots if they were settled before 31st of January 1995. And the new master plan now have actually said that they would be resettled in situ, but in high-rise properties. And this is something which is of huge disadvantage to the slum dwellers, and they have certainly resisted this because this is no longer incremental housing. They can no longer increase the number of rooms that they have in their house. But there's been very low numbers as well settled so far. So if you explore this, if you really unpack what is resettlement and how it has changed over the years, it is, first of all, resettlement has never been free. The slum dwellers have always had to pay low subsidized houses. But at the same time, resettlement itself has not given them the right to property in the way that they have imagined resettlement would. But this myth has continued to perpetuate. So what does this mean? The slum that I was studying, as I earlier mentioned, they were waiting for demolition. And in that wait for demolition, what Arjuna Padura has called, in a different context, in the context of immigration in the West and foreigners coming in the West, he's talked about this fear of uncertainty that provokes a need to be seen to be legal. And certainly with the slum that I was studying, there was this fear of uncertainty. What would happen to them? Because of the way that the violence of law and the culture of legality has pervaded Delhi, but also other metropolitan cities in India, and I'm sure some of you would identify this in other parts of the world as well. A culture of legality that is pervaded, in which law is used as a way to deny rights to people to live in the city. This fear of uncertainty evokes the need to be seen as legal, and in that sense, resettlement is seen as a right to the city because it gives them an entry into the legal city, and they consider themselves as illegal because of the way that the law has been used by the municipality in terms of the number of forced evictions. So they see demolition as a threat to be endured, and this replaces this threat that they endure and therefore accept as a way or a possibility of being included in the legal city. It replaces a possibility of a counter-public terrain of politics. And this politics is seen with a number of participatory governance initiatives with slum demolition and resettlement. So most of the resettlement that we hear about is advertised or proclaimed to be through participatory consultation. But in reality, when you talk to the slum dwellers later on, they say that the participatory was very tokenistic. And this also, more importantly, from where I come from intellectually, I think it produces a temporal space where particular kinds of discourses and politics around the right to the city takes shape, and in this case, particularly a right to the city through a legal right to the city. So it's argued from the perspective of legitimate tenure, and this is how it co-opts squatters' debates, squatters' politics, and squatters' negotiations of everyday rights and everyday struggles through this discourse of the valorisation of resettlement. So I just wanted to show this picture of what we can think about as legal and illegal slums. And in the lives of squatters, I think legality has become quite important. And what is legal and what is illegal has become a very important issue to debate in terms of a counter-public terrain of politics. And this is why I think legality becomes a very important lens of investigation rather than informality per se, because informality would say that these are both slums. But the one on your left is the one which is a resettlement colony, which has slum-like conditions. And the one on your right is a squatter settlement, which has no rights to the property, or because they're settled on public land to which they hold no title. So for squatters living in these illegal, what they understand as illegal slums, is an actual material exclusion from the public realm of the city. And so they aspire to be included in the legal city. For them, the hope of the legal city is to become part of this resettlement. But ironically, this resettlement colony is the one from the 70s and 80s. And you can see the plot sizes are quite big. It's been incrementally improved over time. So it's quite well settled, and people have freehold titles to property. And the irony of the situation is that if the ones on the right, these slum dwellers get resettled now, they're not going to be able to live in these kind of resettlement colonies anymore. Their right to the property will be very, very different. And in fact, in the new resettlement colonies in Delhi's peripheries, they have to carry an identity card at all times. If the municipal officers come and don't see them with the identity cards, they can actually cancel their license to inhabitation. So it certainly isn't a right to property in the way that it is valorized. So I just wanted to put in a few ideas around what's going on, therefore, in the lives of squatters, in the everyday lives, in the way that they struggle and the way that they negotiate this kind of imposition of the violence of law. So aspiring for the legal city becomes a way, a discourse, a speech act, a moral rhetorics of asking or claiming their entitlements from the state to be included in the public realm of the city. So just some of the quotes here. One of my participants, and then this is quite typical. I use this because it's quite articulate, but most of them said very similar things. So he says, I think, others think too, that I would like to improve. My children should get a good education. I would like to build a small house somewhere, keep my children there. but where is the possibility? I will have to continue living here until the government keeps talking of eviction. I don't know when it will happen. This is not permanent. That, and he points across the road. So those two pictures that I showed, the legal and illegal slum, they're just across the road, off a main road. So he points across the road to the resettlement colony and says, that is permanent. That is the only hope. So the legal city is the only hope in the future that all slums are going to be removed from the city for Delhi's drive to create a slum-free city. And then the legal city is not so much to argue that they themselves feel illegal or they themselves feel inferior in any way, but they see the legal city as the only possibility to continue to live in Delhi, to continue to have a right to education, right to livelihoods and employment and so on in Delhi. Following on from that, this internalization of this marginality and the marginal geographies that the slum dwellers feel that they are a part of is also to do with the uneven geography of slum demolition and eviction and resettlement. So not all slums were demolished at the same time. Some slums were demolished earlier than others, and some slums are still left behind waiting for demolition. Even though that they know that their time has come, they don't actually see it happening. And the argument is that those slums which were in the prime property areas, like the commercial and retail areas, were the ones which were demolished first. Those slums which were in the areas that in 2010, when Delhi was hosting the Commonwealth Games, they were in those areas where they had to build these stadiums and the athletes' village and so on. They were the ones who were removed. So those are articulated as the good areas. So one of my participants says, I feel that we're in a bad area. That's why the government is not listening to us. The government has no need for this useless area. The day they need it, they'll automatically become okay. They have no need for this camp. Usually slums are called camps, particularly the ones without legal status. Had this been in the standard area, the well-to-do people would have asked the government to have the slum removed. To me, this is quite interesting, because this is something us as scholars, as activists, we would say, well, this is an elite discourse. This is the discourse where the Delhi's elites have used to actually remove slums, to create the sanitized city. But it's interesting to see the way that the discourse is actually co-opted by some of the participants to making, again, I think the argument of moral rhetorics holds very true here, that they try and make this argument around the similar internalization of those pathological qualities that many of the bureaucracies and bureaucratic elites impose on slums in order to make or stake a claim to the legal city, in order to argue for a right to the city. And then finally, I think I started with thinking about this as Gendron, and definitely much of the project was about the relationships or the negotiation of gender relationships. And as a young architecture student in India, particularly when I was thinking about slums, doing some architectural project on slums, I was continuously told that it's a social project. And what is so architectural about it? Because at the end of the day, you're just going to make a one-room, multi-purpose dwelling. And this one-room, multi-purpose squatter home has pervaded the imagination of students, planners, politicians, and everyone. And that's certainly the imagination of the single plot, of the 25 square meter plot. So when we think about the one-room dwelling, the way it has been pathologized in policy, we kind of think also of the issues that slum dwellers would be facing themselves. And in the slum, this was a big debate, the debate of the one-room squatter home and how it produces these moral pollutions. So there was a lot of debate about domestic violence, about suicides, of incest, of rape, and the argument was that it is the one-room dwelling that has created this, and therefore the state should do something about removing us and taking us to this new place in which we will magically become transformed. So the internalization of the pathologies of the single room was a critical argument to ask or claim entitlements from the state again for resettlement, which was a way to claim for a right to tenure. So one of my participants, she says, one thing is that there's a shortage of space. This is the biggest problem. Because the discussions that a husband and wife need to have in order to run the family, these they are unable to have. You can't do anything in front of the children. Then when they don't have these conversations, what happens is that when crises come in the family, their balance doesn't work. I have one room. If I had two, perhaps I would not have remained worried about my husband for 25 years. I would have it covered in 10 years. If I had a separate room, I would have found ways to run the family. So this is the biggest problem, and 5 or 10% of people live in middle-class colonies. The rest of the country, 80%, lives like this, meaning family relationships cannot be built. This too makes our country backward. So this is a direct relationship between the moral relationships in a family, the family relationships, building of the family relationships as a connection to building of the nation, to the nation's modernity, to the development of the nation. And this argument is the argument that she uses in order to stake this claim to getting resettlement, to getting a right to the city in terms of the state looking and developing and improving their conditions. So I just want to end with this notion of questioning resettlement. Is resettlement really a form of justice in the way that it's perpetuated as a myth by everyone, and everyone seems to be co-opted in this myth? For squatters particularly, I think they don't see it necessarily in the same way as it is perpetuated by politicians and NGOs and planners. For them, the struggles to the right to the city are inseparable from the aspirations for inclusion into the legal city in a context where the culture of legality does not let them remain in any other form in Delhi. Resettlement is seen as the route to the legal city and hence to urban justice. And as the violence of law takes away the possibility of a material home within the slum, which is the illegal city, resettlement becomes the only route to inclusion within the legal city. So I just want to leave you with this question in that case. So then what hope there is, therefore, for a counter-public urban sphere and a feminist politics in these times when slum dwellers themselves have been co-opted into this kind of post-political governance, into this participatory governance structure which is pervading and circulating these forms of myths. Thank you.